Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What should we do? Specifically, what should we do if we want to enjoy freedom from unwanted emotions, if we want to heal emotionally? If you watched the last video, you'll recall that the Buddha recommended examining life ourselves as the only way to living well, rather than relying on dogmas, popular opinions, or blind beliefs that we pick up from others. When we do that, though, he emphasized that we should avoid the major mistake that many seekers and philosophers make, namely, simply trying to think our way to living well. It's true that living well requires some good thinking. After all, we need to test and reject methods that don't yield beneficial results. However, mastering life, becoming a sage, does not require becoming a master thinker. Instead, what we need to do is to get out of our thoughts and into our lives. Since stories are our default method of learning, he gave us a parable that has become very well known. The following translation is from In the Buddha's Words, Bhikkhu Bodhi, editor. He was answering a question put to him by Melankyaputa, who was one of his followers. Suppose a man were wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, brought a surgeon to treat him. The man would say, "I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know whether the man who wounded me was a Khatya, a Brahmin, a merchant, or a worker." And he would say, "I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me. Until I know whether the man who wounded me was tall, short, or of middle height. Until I know whether the man who wounded me was dark, brown, or golden-skinned. Until I know whether the man who wounded me lives in such a village, town, or city. Until I know whether the bow that wounded me was a longbow or a crossbow. Until I know whether the bowstring that wounded me was fiber, reed, sinew, hemp, or bark. Until I know whether the shaft that wounded me was wild or cultivated. Until I know with what kind of feathers the shaft that wounded me was fitted, whether those of a vulture, a heron, a hawk, a peacock, or a stork. Until I know with what kind of sinew the shaft that wounded me was bound, whether that of an ox, a buffalo, a deer, or a monkey. Until I know what kind of arrowhead it was that wounded me, whether spiked, or razor-tipped, or curved, or barbed, or calf-toothed, or lancet-shaped. All this would still not be known to that man, and meanwhile, he would die. Obviously, if we die, we cannot live, and so cannot live well. It's foolish to get stuck thinking. Life wounds all of us. What we need to do is to heal the wound. What we should not do is to get stuck trying to answer endless questions. It's high time for you to stop trying to understand the answers to endless questions. It's high time for you to begin also to practice. How? What exactly should you do? It's simple. If you are serious about living well and not just thinking about it, master some classic spiritual practice. The English word spiritual comes from the Latin word spiritus, which means a breath or wind. Etymologically, then, a spiritual practice is a breathing practice. All spiritual practices are bodily practices. Their purpose is to get us beyond mere thinking, to break our addiction to compulsive thoughting. Whether moving or stilling, they are all meditative practices. The Buddha is crystal clear. Quote, "There can be no meditation for those who are not wise, and no wisdom for those who do not meditate." End quote from the Dhammapada, Esran's translation. Quote, "Meditation brings wisdom. Lack of meditation leaves ignorance." End quote. If you have a meditative practice and are not yet wise, intensify your daily practice. If you are serious about becoming wise, about living well, and do not yet have a meditative practice, get one and begin meditating seriously every day. If you need to select one, which one would be the best for you? It's impossible to tell in advance. In the Stress Reduction Wizardry video sequence in the Dennis Bradford PhD YouTube channel, I offer what I consider to be the best two options for most people, namely aliveness awareness, video 9, and Zazen, video 11. This is where the ideas presented in this series become concrete. Either you'll master a classic meditative practice, or you'll never be a sage. So, if you are serious about living well, you now understand what to do. If, though, you are suffering intensely, your mind might be in such turmoil that you cannot yet begin practicing in that way. Your emotional agitation may simply be too great even to meditate for 90 seconds. If that's your situation, what should you do? Again, in subsequent videos, I give you two tactics that can resolve that problem. Pick one and use it. Once you have reduced the emotional turmoil to a more normal level, then you may profitably begin aliveness awareness, Zazen, or some similar classic practice. In subsequent videos, I offer you the two tactics. If you master either one, you'll be able to dissolve any unwanted emotion, such as fear, anger, grief, or loneliness, relatively quickly. So, they are reactive tactics. By way of contrast, aliveness awareness, Zazen, and similar practices are proactive tactics. The more you master them, the less emotional distress will afflict you in the first place. Before introducing the reactive tactics, I explain how they work. To make that easier to understand, I do what I have already done with philosophy and spiritual, namely, clarify how I'm using the key words. Once you understand clearly how those practices might work, you'll likely be eager to test them for yourself. The good news is that only one belief is required, namely, that they might be beneficial. That's it. That itself is sufficient to distinguish what is spiritual from what is religious, which requires faith in a creed. With respect to any classic spiritual practice, again, the only belief you'll need is the belief that it might promote emotional healing. Armed with that single belief, it's just a matter of learning what to do and testing it for yourself. Be well.